And in my case, when I went to Sheffield University in England in 1973 to start my Master of Architecture course, Professor David Gosling had just been appointed there as the head of the Department of Architecture. And then in 1989, when I was coming here as a visiting professor, I heard from David that he had been appointed a professor, in actual fact with a special title which I have to read because it's very long. It's a State of Ohio eminent scholar in urban design at the University of Cincinnati. So we both met again after many years. And obviously our academic roads are crossing from time to time. And they're crossing again here today in Muncie, which is quite nice. David Gosling is not new to the United States in the sense that he actually, after his first degree in architecture at Manchester University in England, came to the MIT for his Master of Architecture, and he studied there with Kevin Lynch and Louis Mumford. Went then to Yale for a Master in City Planning, and at that time was a proud owner of a 1953 Studebaker. And I can't tell you what car he's driving now because it's not appropriate for our economic situation, so I'll skip on that. And back in England, he was appointed Deputy Chief Architect of Runcorn Newtown, which is next to Liverpool. And then he became, after a few years, the Chief Architect of Irvine Newtown in near Glasgow in Scotland. I mentioned that in 1973 he became a head of the Department of Architecture of Sheffield University, and he subsequently was appointed Dean of the Faculty of Architecture in 1978. He's the author of a long list of articles and publications, which I don't want to go through, but I'd like to mention a couple of books which he has published. The first one published in 1976 called the Design and Planning of Retail Systems, stemming from his experience as a designer in Runcorn and Irvine Newtown, written with Barry Maitland and published in England and in Russia. And the second important book in 1984 called Concepts of Urban Design, which is a widely circulated book in Britain and in this country. And he's working now on a new book together with Michael Wilford, who is a partner in the firm of Sterling and Wilford, on philosophies of urban design. And probably the title is going to be Theories and Paradigms of Urban Design, something like that, going to be published by Rizzoli. He's been working as a consultant in urban design and planning all over the world, in different parts of the world, from Asia to Latin America. And in particular, I'd like to mention his work as an urban design consultant for the Docklands Development Corporation, because this is the main topic of tonight's talk. And in this work, as well as in previous work, he's been working together with Gordon Cullen, whom some of you may know as the famous author of Townscape and famous urban design and illustrator and architectural designer. And David is now doing research and consultancy work as a director of the Center for Urban Design of the University of Cincinnati. It's a center part of the School of Architecture and Design there. And I think we will show some of the work that they are currently doing in this center for the city of Cincinnati. So I'm very proud to introduce to you tonight David Gosling. Please join me in welcoming him to this podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. After that very protracted and very flattering introduction from Kiley, I wonder what more there is to say. The title of my talk tonight is about the role of urban design in what I call the public realm, and particularly my experience in London Docklands. Kiley, in his introduction, mentioned the fact that I'm writing a new book with Michael Wilford, the partner of James Sterling. I've known Michael Wilford for many years, in fact, since the time that James Sterling was designing the now demolished housing in Runcorn New Town. Michael Wilford and I have, in teaching many studios, both in this country and in the United Kingdom, have often discussed the role of urban design as a system and come to the conclusion that there is no consensus of opinion about it. But the one thing we are agreed upon is the failure of most major planning and architectural schemes is largely due to the lack of understanding of the role of the public realm. And I would describe the public realm as the skeletal structure of a city. It is the ordering system, if you like, of any city, historical or contemporary. It's the structure of streets, open spaces, public parks, plazas, landscape, waterways, riversides, and so on. And our view is that if that public realm, either by natural accretion or deliberate design, can be made sufficiently strong and memorable in Kevin Lynch's terms, then you can actually give more freedom rather than less freedom to the individual architect and designer of the separate buildings which form components within that public realm. In the years in which I acted as a consultant for London Docklands, I have to say at the end, and it's a sort of presentation which is not particularly usual, I have to say that it's with a sense of great disappointment that I see the final results, because I believe this whole concept of the design of the public realm within the total concept of urban design was largely misunderstood and was lost. In fact, when the London Docklands Development Corporation was established in 1980, it was seen by many, including myself, as the biggest urban opportunity in Europe for the last 300 years. In fact, since the Great Fire of London in 1666, followed by Sir Christopher Wren's plan for the reconstruction of London. It's ironical to note that the same forces, whether it's the royal family or vested interests in big business, defeated Christopher Wren's plan in the same way that the application of a comprehensive urban design plan in London Docklands was again lost 300 years later. What I hope to do tonight is show you and trace the development of these ideas, of what might have been and of what actually happened. Could I have the lights, please? The whole issue of London Docklands really began with the election of the Thatcher government in 1979. As many of you will know, until that time, the economy of Britain and the manufacturing base was in constant and spiral decline. There was a benevolent form of a social welfare state operated by the Labour government, but within this declining economy. When Mrs. Thatcher became elected leader of the Conservative Party and later the Prime Minister of Britain, a post she held for 12 years, she pursued what was then a growing force throughout the world, particularly here in North America, but also in Europe, of the concept of the market economy. And what the application of the market economy made as far as urban development was concerned was that the view of this new radical form of government, albeit a right rather than left-wing form of government, but nevertheless radical, was that the intervention of planning and planning regulations was the one thing which destroyed opportunities for urban development and renewal. The decline of the manufacturing base in Britain was also accompanied by a strange phenomenon, which was the rise in prosperity of the southeast of England, centred around London. And the reason for this is not hard to find, but as the manufacturing base disappeared, it was replaced by what is euphemistically called by some economists as the service sector. And the service sector, of course, can include anything from tourism to the banking and financial industries. That was very successful, mainly because, certainly in terms of banking and finance and insurance, in terms of time zones, London was exactly halfway between New York and Tokyo, so that these three great financial centres operated in unison. So it was inevitable, in a sense, that an urban boom would take place in the southeast of England to the cost, in many ways, of the rest of the country. The history of London Docklands is a very old one, as you can see from the maps on the screen there. The construction of the London Docklands as a port began during the Napoleonic Wars, and by the end of the 19th century, London had become the biggest port in the entire world, both in terms of export and import volume, as well as shipping tonnage. And it held that preeminent position for the first part of the century. However, as the development of Europe began elsewhere, and particularly with the intervention of the Second World War, with the destruction of London and many of the European cities by German bombing, the Port of London was destroyed. And by the end of the war, not only was the construction or reconstruction of the port much slower than the Port of Rotterdam, which then took over as the Europe's preeminent port, but there were also other major changes in the way in which labour was used in the shipping industry. There was a change of technology towards containerization, which meant that the idea of large cargo ships travelling up the Thames estuary to the Port of London became redundant. So London was left with this huge area of land, some 7 miles long by 2 miles wide, of huge water basins, redundant warehouses, redundant industries, and much more seriously, a population which then was unemployable. The Thatcher government thought that the only way in which this huge and important area of London could be revitalized was to seek investment from the private sector, and it established the London Docklands Development Corporation. The Development Corporation, ironically, was set up on very similar lines to the previous new town development corporations, with one major exception. Whereas the new town development corporations, which had been very successfully, not only socially but economically as well, were responsible for the assembly of land, they were also responsible for the design and the construction of the housing areas, of the industrial areas, the shopping centres, the recreational areas, and so on. The view of the Thatcher government was that this organizational system worked well, but they wanted to see that most of the redevelopment of London Docklands was done through the private sector on a ratio of approximately 9:1, and that the Docklands Development Corporation was seen just as an implementation authority or as an enabler in land assembly and the construction of infrastructure. So the main focus of London Docklands was what was called the Isle of Dogs, which you see here on the slide. It's a peninsula surrounded on three sides by the River Thames, and within the centre is the huge dock basins of the West India Docks and the Millwall Basin to the south, surrounded, as I say, by an urban crust of derelict housing estates built in the pre-war period and to some extent in the interwar period. The Isle of Dogs, in being seen as the focus of development by the government, was also the scene of a new planning experiment, if you can call it that, and that was the creation of an enterprise zone. It was said that if one created an enterprise zone which was entirely free of planning constraints, then investment in that particular urban area would be that much more rapid. Indeed, prior even to the establishment of the London Docklands Development Corporation, such development had already taken place upstream. This is St Catherine's Dock, a very famous area of London, adjacent to Tower Bridge and the Tower of London in the background there. And this was the scene of the development of tourism to a large extent, of the creation of a World Trade Center, of huge hotel development and marina development, and perhaps begs the question whether indeed the Docklands Development Corporation was really needed, whether this sort of early development would act as a catalyst for later proposals. I was appointed in 1980 as one of the first planning consultants with the intention on the part of the chief executive that I would take over as chief planner to the Docklands Development Corporation, something which didn't occur for a number of reasons. But in the early days, I was asked to set up a team of urban designers, mostly drawn from previous students with whom I'd worked at Sheffield University, some drawn from London, and this small team of urban designers was established to try and create, albeit outside a legislative framework, an urban design structure for the whole of London Docklands and the Isle of Dogs in particular. Amongst the very many important factors about the Isle of Dogs was its relationship with other pieces of architecture, other areas of urban development outside it, the most famous of which, of course, is Greenwich Palace across the Thames, which is the work not only of Sir Christopher Wren, but of Vanbrugh and of Inigo Jones. Christopher Wren's pupil, Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was responsible for perhaps the finest Baroque churches in London, evolved an idea which we took up called the Greenwich Axis. And the idea of the Greenwich Axis was the relationship of major buildings and vistas in a sequential way, some 2 miles long. And if you think that this is interrupted by the intervention of various topographical elements as well as man-made elements, then the whole thing takes upon the values of a sort of magical ley line of this mysterious force, if you like, of the relationship of man-made artifacts. the view taken by Hawksmoor was that if the Observatory of Greenwich was drawn with its axis through Greenwich Palace immediately to the south of the Thames, in a diagonal axis going from southeast to northwest, it intersected with the tower of St Anne's Limehouse, which is one of Hawksmoor's most notable churches. There were other relationships, visual relationships, from the Isle of Dogs to such vistas as the relationship of this particular part of London to St Paul's Cathedral, designed by Wren himself. And here you see what I'm really trying to say about this importance of the axis. In many people's view, this is probably the most handsome man-made artifact in England in any historical period. It's the combination of work of the greatest Renaissance architects of the period, ranging from the Palladian design of the Queen's House, which you see at the top of the photograph by Inigo Jones, to the great Baroque palaces designed by Sir Christopher Wren and Lord Vanbrugh. And what we were trying to say is that if one took the Greenwich axis as the ordering element, that this was the clue, this was the key to the structuring of the public realm. The public realm then was to form part of the physical framework for the future development that was to take place in its relationship of spaces and buildings. At that time, I urged the Development Corporation to hire as a parallel consultant Gordon Cullen, whom Kiley mentioned in his introduction. And Gordon Cullen joined the team, and as the team grew, inevitably, as so often happens in complex design teams, disagreements occurred. And in fact, the team split three ways, between the chief planner, Edward Hollenby, who was previously a civil servant working as chief planner for one of the London boroughs, and his team, myself and my own team from Sheffield, and Gordon Cullen, and none of us could agree as to what really should be the policy, the urban design policy for London Docklands. My view, and it's a view I still hold, was that it should relate to this concept of public realm planning, of not providing a master plan, but providing a determined spatial relationship for the buildings which may happen in the future. Hollenby's view was a much more pragmatic one, that developers had already started investing money, and what we should assemble was a plan which was an amalgam of all present and future developers' proposals in the private sector, in fact a non-plan. Cullen didn't believe that an overall plan was needed. He believed that one analysed the island in what he calls serial vision by looking at the various nodal communities around the periphery and relating them to these great central water spaces. This is one of Gordon's key drawings in the early days. And as you'll see, even at that time, he accepted in some way the concept of Hawksmoor's Greenwich axis, but had, in my view, a total misconception about space. If you look at the building blocks he arranges, particularly those on the left-hand side of the diagram, adjacent to the water basins, it looks like a series of intimate, almost medieval squares. But each one of those blocks is something like 300 or 400 feet long, which shows that to create that sort of enclosure, those buildings would have had to be at least 10, maybe 12 stories high on a monumental, massive and inhuman scale, and that's where our first disagreement began. He did a series of very beautiful and evocative drawings of these modal points around the periphery of the peninsula as serial vision, as sequential sketches, some, I think, 40 or 45 in all. And a lot of them contained amazingly simple but amazingly telling ideas. This one, for instance, is on the so-called mud chute, which was an artificially man-made hill created by the spoil from the excavation of the docks in the 18th century. And the point he makes here is that in looking southwards towards Greenwich Palace, you get a much greater sense of immediacy by creating a screen of planting so that the towers of Greenwich Palace appear not as part of a distant land across the river, but as part of the immediate landscape itself. For our contribution, we did a number of what I call a prospectus for development. It was in the days before we started using computer imaging and computer-aided planning. These were laboriously done alternative plans using this idea of the Greenwich axis and the ordering elements, showing what may happen in the eventuality of different types of development. That, for instance, in this particular development, the focus was mainly on industrial and commercial development, taking up the available land area. Or in the second one, that it would be more based upon housing and tourism and using North Sea oil technology to build floating platforms in the water basins, which were economically incapable of being drained and landfilled. So the water basins were to remain in any event, and we thought that these could be used as housing communities or villages, or a combination of various elements of housing, tourism, and commerce, and so one could go on. Obviously, with the use of a computer imaging base, then in theory, literally hundreds of alternative plans could be created. And it's ironical to think that in later days, when it was all too late, the developers, particularly the major North American developers, Olympia, York, who built Battery Park City in New York and later Canary Wharf in London, complained bitterly to the Development Corporation that such a plan as this did not exist and did not have the legislative strength to disallow inappropriate development on adjacent sites. So you got the Alice in Wonderland situation of the erstwhile planners and civil servants of central government saying that they wanted to see no planning controls whatsoever, and the developers, the investors, saying that was nonsense. What was needed was much more rigid planning controls to ensure the highest possible standards of development. And indeed, albeit too late, that is exactly what Olympia York, with their master planners Skidmore, Owings and Merrill of Chicago, set about to do in the latter part of the 1980s. The resultant plan was this one, drawn up by Ted Hollenby with the remainder of my original team. Hollenby rejected the urban realm plans we did, which were consigned to an appendix in the report along with Gordon Cullen's perspectives, and this became, in a sense, the definitive plan, which, as you can see, is a non-plan of total chaos. Hollenby then fired me. My two protégés from Sheffield University went on to be highly successful private architects with the patronage of Hollenby and the London Docklands Development Corporation, and my other protégé married Gordon Cullen's daughter, so everybody was happy. The real problem is seen here in this diagram of the enterprise zone. The enterprise zone are those yellow shaded areas, which covers, as you can see, a major amount of publicly acquired space for private sector investment. And this was all very well. It was free of any planning constraints. There was no overall planning structure, as I say, and all developers were encouraged to come in and do what they wanted. Now, I have been accused by my erstwhile masters of being wise with hindsight, but this isn't exactly true, because at the time I warned that a number of serious faults or defects would occur with this policy. The first one is that though investment was slow to begin with, and the first buildings to be constructed were mainly small factories and warehouses and industrial sheds, as the development became apparently prosperous and successful, it was inevitable that new pressures would come against the relatively low land values in the first place. Land values, to give you an illustration, in the early days of the early 1980s was about £40,000, say $70,000 an acre. By 1985, that same land for housing had gone up to £400,000 an acre, or $750,000. Now, it doesn't take a genius of a mathematician to work out that the concept of affordable housing, which was an avowed aim of the Development Corporation, was out of the window, because the volume house builders, if they were paying that sort of money for housing land, could only build luxury housing. The other problem was that the early developers who built their tin sheds on these sites suddenly saw an opportunity to make a great deal of money, because you must remember there were no zoning codes, there were no density issues or plot ratios, so they began to tear down these sheds and build much higher and much more densely packed commercial development. And as you do this, you must remember that whereas this policy of rapid development and redevelopment does work to a large extent in a place like Manhattan, it works in Manhattan because of the extremely rigid and orderly infrastructure system of the gridiron network. In London, as I mentioned, the plan of Sir Christopher Wren was never implemented. So instead of the great boulevards which Paris was to see later in history with Haussmann's plan, London was and still has a medieval street network of almost total inaccessibility. And it begs the question that as more and more development started to take place, and there were more and more jobs being created and provided, in Canary Wharf alone, the first phase is supposed to provide 40,000 jobs. How on earth were you going to get people into work and out of work in the evening? And indeed, the first architecture which was built has already been demolished. This is one of Terry Farrell's early postmodern works of architecture. It's a television studios on what is now Canary Wharf, and was demolished to make way for Canary Wharf, having survived some 3 years. And new and more bizarre structures were going up, such as the Cascades development, designed by a young firm of architects, Piers, Guth, Campbell and Zagolovich, called the Cascades. And this is a luxury housing development near to Canary Wharf, where the units in the halcyon days of the mid-80s were selling for a minimum of $1 million a piece, going up to $3 million. This perhaps shows the point I'm making, perhaps in greater detail. London has a decrepit, but still nevertheless comprehensive and reasonably efficient public transport system, the subway system known as the London Underground. But the problem was the London Underground stopped short by a long way of the Isle of Dogs. It goes as far as the City of London, the financial district of London, and you'll see that the red network of highways, which are the main trunk routes, as they're called, feeding traffic into the east part of London, is a totally bizarre and disorganized network. To illustrate the point, my own city of Sheffield was some 170 miles north of London, and I used to drive down when I worked there as a consultant. It took me 2 hours to drive down to the northern borders of central London, and then 2 hours to cross London. So it took me 2 hours to travel 160 miles. The speed limit is somewhat higher in the UK than it is here. In any case, you break it more often. And the distance from the outer edge of London to London Docklands was about 20 miles. So it took 2 hours to travel 20 miles as against 2 hours to travel 160 miles. And this is the root of the problem, because nobody had thought, whether people came by private car or public transport, how you were going to get people in and out of this centre, which goes back to my making the case for comprehensive planning. You can't just say, let market forces decide, because market forces cannot decide issues like public transport and issues of access. For many years, of course, in Britain, people have talked about various advanced forms of public transport, of computer-controlled individual cabs or cars. This was a cartoon from the Architect's Journal in the 1960s, something called Cab Track, which shows in the jaundiced eye of the cartoonist that it's all very well and convenient to travel in your own computer-controlled car, but since it's on an upper deck guideway, it goes tearing through Westminster Abbey and through people's bathroom windows. So the solution was what some of you I know here tonight have experienced as Toy Town Railway. Toy Town Railway is indeed a computer-controlled electric network of a line going from the north of the Isle of Dogs to the south of the Isle of Dogs, opposite Greenwich Palace, and is a very entertaining and pretty little train upon which to ride. Now, the reality is that this little train, seen on a typically bleak and grimy day in the summer of, I think, 1988, has a 3 or 4 car train which takes about 300 or 400 passengers. The intervals between these trains is a minimum distance of 3 minutes travel time. And again, it doesn't take a mathematician to realize that if you even just have 40,000 workers working in Canary Wharf alone, let alone all the other major developments, it's going to take you all day to get the workers into work and all night to get them back home again. So what has happened is that the developers, Olympia and York, have finally bludgeoned, blackmailed, and also put up many millions of dollars of their own money to extend the London Underground system to the Isle of Dogs. But of course that is going to take at least 5 years to complete until it's actually running. And so Canary Wharf, which is now completed in its first phase, is really left without an adequate public transport system, again going back to this issue of planning. Another jaundiced view of the Toy Town Railway was on the occasion of the grand opening of the railway in 1987 by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who is a very worthy lady but not known for her deep sense of humour. Queen Elizabeth was invited to press the button of the computer-controlled driverless train, and she stepped into the cab, and unknown to all the officials, a small mongrel dog managed to ascend the track 20 feet above ground level, wander along the track, urinate on the live rail, electrocute itself. The door slammed shut and Her Majesty the Queen was locked inside the driverless computer-controlled train for 2 hours, which shows the value of British technology. What was happening in the meantime, of course, was that development was taking a pace, and I mentioned the escalating land and property values through the early 1980s, which were inevitably faced with a tremendous crash at the end of the 1980s. And many of the warehouses along the River Thames were turned into very elegant and very expensive apartments, such as the one you see here outside the St. Catherine's Marina. It's interesting to note in passing that Robert Turner, one of the younger partners from SOM in Chicago, who is the proud owner of not one but two separate apartments in the Mies van der Rohe block on Lakeshore Drive, wanted to buy, as he has a lakeshore view in Chicago, wanted to buy a riverside view in London, and thought he could buy an apartment for about the same cost as he spent acquiring one of the apartments in Lakeshore Drive. He was astounded that the cost of trying to acquire a similar apartment was something like 5 times more expensive than in Chicago. During our time in the wilderness, and of course, as Peter Eisenman would say, I share it with all sorts of other geniuses, myself and John Ferguson, the only loyal friend I had remaining from the team, amused ourselves by doing uncommissioned studies for the Isle of Dogs, much to the annoyance of the Development Corporation. This one was exhibited in the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, I think in 1984, in which we provided an alternative suggestion to the transport issue. We said, instead of the Toy Town Railway, how about transporting the city gents to work on a giant roller coaster, so as they go up one loop and down the next, they can get off at a station and then proceed along their way. We were finally forgiven, mainly because Ted Hollenby retired and brought back into the fold, and by this time, of course, it was really too late, that too much development had taken place to really make any difference. Amongst the more interesting studies we did was to face this problem of escalating property costs, and this one, which you see on the screen, is the way in which one could provide housing at a reasonable cost without using a great land take. The arena, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner, is a public sports arena with a tremendous provision for the general public who live in the area. But the arena couldn't sustain itself, since it was clearly not a profit-making centre or development, and so must be supported by commercial or upmarket housing development to sustain it. So one of the solutions we came up with, which was borrowed from Frank Lloyd Wright, was to use central core structures with cantilevered upper floors, of building towers in the water of the docks, so that the tower took up the smallest land area, and we used the air rights over the arena, the equivalent of 6 or 7 stories in the air, with 20 or 30 story towers to provide this sustaining commercial development. The real breakthrough, of course, came in the mid-1980s with the signing up of Olympia York to develop Canary Wharf. There you see it outlined in white. It's some 2 miles long, almost 2 miles long, by about half a mile wide, and is one of the biggest single commercial developments, certainly in Europe, if not in the world. Olympia York, as I say, took the highly radical view that if the Docklands Development Corporation were not going to provide an urban design plan or urban design guidelines, they most certainly were. And Skidmore, Owings and Merrill were commissioned as master planners by Olympia and York to provide what I consider to be some of the most draconian architectural guidelines I've ever seen anywhere. And when I say draconian, I don't mean that they're necessarily bad, though I do take issue with the trend that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill have followed in recent years of an obsession with historicism and neoclassicism, given that they were the pioneers of modern 20th century office architecture. This was one of their first ideas. In the top right-hand corner, you see three disparate towers, one looking like a vertical Houses of Parliament, another like a Norman Foster building, and another like an I.M. Pei building. You'll see that I drew a faint green line on the left-hand side of the photograph, which was poor old Nicholas Hawksmoor's benighted Greenwich axis, and you can tell that Olympia York and SOM didn't think much to that idea, since they completely ignored it. This was one of the first, and I'm happy to say, rejected designs for that central skyscraper. This is Cohen-Peterson Fox's interpretation of what a 60-story Houses of Parliament might look like. On the other hand, I'm not sure that I'm right, because what in fact was provided and what is built is, to my mind, amongst the most dull commercial architecture I've ever seen in the world. And though I know Caesar Perry is a highly respected and in fact innovative American architect, I think his proposal for the Canary Wharf Tower, the central tower you see there in the model, is really a major disappointment. The problem for Caesar Perry that he faced architecturally was that it was an entirely new building type. It was within a whole new range of building typologies. The transformation of the banking world, of the financial services industries, by the very rapid advances in information technology, meant that the old office tower was redundant, and that each office floor plate had to be literally the size of a supermarket, with all the operators, the money dealers and so on, operating their own computer terminals in this vast unobstructed space. So the footprint of the building was far vaster than any footprint for any traditional office block, and there you have the problem, because the block itself is 60 stories high, and had it been designed as a conventional office block, it would have been a slim and elegant tower, instead of which it is a squat and unbelievably massive presence in that part of London as an urban intervention. The other buildings designed around it with this odd neoclassical framework is, to my mind, still a mystery. This shows the architectural design guidelines within the urban design guidelines done by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, which were very prescriptive to a degree in establishing minimum colonnade widths and heights and cornice lines, building materials, string courses and so on, which at least give the sense of visual coherence and continuity, albeit within a historicist framework. That is one of the first perspectives. That's the Caesar Perry building in the foreground, and you'll see the other architectural renderings around it. And this is a perspective showing jolly British city gents taking afternoon tea on the terrace, which is, if I can be sour, the North American view of what the British must look like. It also shows a certain lack of understanding of the transfer of design from one culture to another, from one country to another. And I've been just as guilty of that as anybody else. So I'm not criticizing them for operating in this way. But when SOM, and particularly Robert Turner and Bruce Graham, say that this is learning from the lessons of Georgian London. This is arrant nonsense, because first of all, it isn't Georgian architecture, which is very clean, very stripped down, classical architecture, borrowing mostly from, excuse me, borrowing from ancient Greek architecture, and relying very much upon elegant proportions, and particularly the relationship of heights of buildings to the spaces they address, as in the Georgian squares of Bloomsbury, or Regent's Park for that matter. This is not Georgian architecture. This is the architecture of the turn of the century, of the Edwardian era. It's not even the architecture of Sir Edwin Lutyens. It's the architecture of vulgar commercial architects like Sir Edward Blomfield, of whom I'm sure none of you have heard, but whose work appears in the pages of Bannister's Fletcher's History of Architecture. And to me, to my mind, this is entirely inappropriate for the purpose which it's trying to achieve. I show these three buildings rather, because this is what I believe innovative commercial architecture is all about. On the left, you get Sir Norman Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. On the right, you get I.M. Pei's Raffles Centre in Singapore. And in the middle, interestingly enough, you get the last building designed by the original pioneer of commercial architecture in SOM, beginning with his first design, the Lever Building in Park Avenue in New York, and ending with this central bank building in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And Gordon Bunshaft was the key designer, for my money, that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill ever had throughout its history. And what Bunshaft was doing here was not just transferring American technology and American design aesthetics to an alien culture. He was showing a great understanding of that culture and climate in designing this great triangular building with huge inserts of tropical gardens, so that those offices, instead of overlooking the hot Arabian desert or the Red Sea, overlooked internal tropical gardens with hanging plants floor by floor. And to my mind, Bunshaft's interpretation of architecture in another culture was vastly more successful than the slavish adaptation of early 20th century British architecture. Now you see the completed first phase of Canary Wharf with Toy Town Railway going through this upper level station. The Caesar Pelli building is not in this photograph, and if you consider these are some of the smaller structures, you will see what I mean by the overwhelming and perhaps inappropriate scale of the development within the context of London. There were some great successes towards the end of the 1980s, not in Canary Wharf, but in other areas adjacent to it. This is the design for the Financial Times printing works by Nicholas Grimshaw, which at night is quite spectacular, where you see the great German printing presses at work behind these great glass walls, which you see between the service towers. And to me, this is appropriate late 20th century industrial and commercial architecture. Nevertheless, this is the final version of the SOM master plan. Right at the top, in the river bend, you see a new development being designed in high technology style by Richard Rogers, but in the foreground you see this application of neoclassicism in the Canary Wharf development. Interestingly enough, in the very late stages of the Canary Wharf development, Olympia in York relented in the face of criticism against the insistence on these historical styles and turned to other architects to provide other solutions, the most original of which was the invitation to James Stirling and Michael Wilford to design the buildings you see in the foreground for apartment use. What Stirling Wilford did, interestingly, was to redraw the perspective. They even redrew Caesar Pelli's design for him, which I don't think he thanked them for. And in the foreground, you see Stirling's latest devices and icons, which reappear in other developments in Tokyo for this spectacular riverside apartment housing development. And that was the block model as they envisaged it. Needless to say, of course, it never got built because Olympia and York felt it was just unsaleable in a normal housing commercial market. And turning now to the final part of my presentation, I just want to complete with two studies which were done towards the end of that period. One is an academic, a School of Architecture study, and the other is our own design for the area south of Canary Wharf as a response to the constraints of the Beaux-Arts principles of Canary Wharf itself. The first was designed by four students working in partnership at Sheffield University in 1984-85, with myself as the tutor and Michael Wilford as the visiting critic, visiting professor. And what these four students did was re-examine this whole issue of urban intervention in the reconstruction of part of a major capital city. They studied this part of London right down from the urban grain of the metropolitan area to the design of individual buildings, and was a prodigious piece of work which took them the entire year to do, but which won them a great many prizes both in Britain and in Europe. Here they did a figure ground study comparing the grain of the West End of London, which you see on the left-hand side of the photograph, mostly Georgian development around the great royal parks of Regent's Park at the top, Hyde Park in the middle, Green Park towards the bottom. You see the River Thames winding its way through. The middle figure ground study is the City of London, which shows the intricate medieval street pattern of the financial district to which I referred. And then finally, the East End of London, including the Isle of Dogs, which you see on the left-hand portion of that third figure ground study. And the point that we're making here was that if you look at it in a regional sense, London is by no means the confused urban centre it seems to be. The Thames estuary actually has, including the derelict water basins, an immense amount of undeveloped public open space, particularly towards the east, and running laterally into the Thames basin from the north and from the south are great areas of linear parks, some wildernesses like Hackney Marshes in the north, some formal parks like Dulwich Park to the south. And taking the figure ground study, they looked at ways in which one might reorganize the hitherto undeveloped docks in the eastern sector of Docklands. This picture is looking north-south horizontally and east-west vertically. The Isle of Dogs is shown at the top, the peninsula, and then lower down on the right-hand side are the Royal Docks, which are the last undeveloped water basins in the London Docklands Development Corporation area. And what they were trying to do was understand the urban grain and how that urban grain was established, mostly through 19th century development of row housing for dock workers' families, and the relationship of that urban grain to the much larger scale urban grain of the docks and the wharves themselves. In the top, you see then, taking that particular area, an attempt to provide a layering system of development which is relatively dense, but following some of the pioneering work of Sir Leslie Martin at Cambridge University in the 60s, the idea that you do not need to build high to maximize the development of any particular site, that if you organize the building designs and structures in a certain way, you can still provide adequate public space. But by a layering system and a particular configuration of buildings, you can provide a more humane environment where the buildings never rise above 5 or 6 stories. And they did a number of models testing out this theory of the relationship of density of development to public space, and then took it right down to individual building designs in the public realm. And the final project was the Helen Keyes development, which is the design that one of the students, Stephen Proctor, from that previous thesis project, worked with me in partnership in the year of 1988, shortly before I came here to the United States. Since Canary Wharf was already half built, we felt that there was no point turning our back on it, and we deliberately related our design as a series of internal boulevards and watercourts with Canary Wharf itself, which is immediately to the north. It was mixed use. It was of lower density, but still high-rise skyscrapers of apartment blocks, hotels, and office blocks. But the point we were trying to make, taking our clue from Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's urban design guidelines, was the importance of buildings as far as they address the world of the pedestrian. Their theory is an interesting one, is that building design in its immediacy is of little importance above the 5th story. Now that may seem a sort of fairly crude rule, but what they're really saying is that as you traverse along a street or through a public square, you really look at what is immediately around you and the sense of what is immediately around you. And what they did in their prescriptive rules was design what they called street walls, which were the walls addressing the central spaces, the boulevards, the piazzas and so forth, the plazas, the pedestrian alleyways, and the water walls, which were the walls of the buildings facing outwards into the docks themselves. And it was our view that if you can develop a vocabulary of urban artifacts which stress this point, an example of an urban artifact taken from history is the colonnade system, then you can build into the rules without telling the architect how he or she should design that building, that colonnades are needed in this particular circumstance to provide coherence within the public realm structure. So, for instance, we devised what we call colonnade coding, always generally saying that because of the scale of the development, that colonnade should be at least 2 stories and probably not more than 4 stories in height on either the water wall or the street wall sides. This shows how decks might be built over the water or promenade decks within the walls of the docks themselves. And we devised something like 27 different coding systems for colonnades within our design guidelines. And Gordon, we we completed the scheme with our first experiments in the application of computer imaging with a flyby scheme, which was not animated but took a very large number of images so that one could traverse around it to understand the way in which the Heron Keys buildings, the one in light grey, related to the much bigger structures of Canary Wharf. So to conclude, is my point that the idea of public realm planning is not new at all. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the 1748 plan of Giambattista Noli for Pope Sixtus V, the Plan of Rome. And the reason why this is regurgitated by lecturers ad nauseum across the world is that it has something very important to say in graphic representation. The idea of using figure ground studies in the way in which Noli did, and which were later developed with great sophistication by Colin Rowe's studio at Cornell over the last 10 or 15 years, is that Noli is saying by reversing images of negative against positive, positive against negative, which has connections with Gestalt psychology, is that you begin to get a greater understanding of the relationship in which buildings either form space or spaces form buildings. And furthermore, that the external spaces of buildings relating to the buildings themselves are by no means the end of the story. That the internal spaces of buildings, of the great basilicas, temples and churches of Rome, because they were part of the public realm, an extension of the public realm, were of equal importance, which is why you see in the Noli plan the floor plans, the ground plans of many of the most important monuments. And as artifacts, I use the example of colonnades, which led into our work in Cincinnati, which I think will be the subject of some lecture in the future. I took through the various committees of Cincinnati, the 2000 Plan Committee and the City Planning Committee, through a number of these slides to say that one can learn from history that the idea of applying a colonnade, of course, goes back to Greco-Roman times and was seen at its best in the Renaissance, particularly in Italy. This is Brunelleschi's first major building, I think in 1419, of the Foundlings Hospital in Florence. And the interesting thing for me to see this for the first time in Florence was that colonnades are not just appropriate to a Mediterranean climate or a warm climate. The climate in Florence in winter in northern Italy is a pretty fierce climate, and colonnade systems can not only provide the sense of continuity of the public realm, but serve a very useful function of weather protection. And throughout history, you can see example after example right up to the present day. This is Jefferson's beautiful design for the University of Virginia, which begs the question why more architects aren't presidents of the United States. Sorry. And bringing one right up to date is the example of Eisenman's Wexner Museum at Ohio State University. To my mind, it's a failure, I think, as an art gallery for all sorts of technical reasons, which is confirmed by art critics. It's nevertheless a masterpiece in urban design terms, in linking together and welding together disparate architectural elements on a major university campus. And the way in which he uses a combination of colonnade, pergola and loggia, which you see in the background of the photograph there, is, in my view, a masterpiece. And perhaps of lesser impact, but still nevertheless a beautiful solution to the same problem is the loggia which James Sterling and Michael Wilford designed for the Performing Arts Centre at Cornell University. And finally, as I said to the council members in Cincinnati, it's already there in their own city, though they choose to ignore it. The Procter & Gamble headquarters, designed by Cohn Peterson Fox, is, I'm told, an outstanding example of postmodern architecture, and in the larger context of the city as a landmark gateway building on the eastern sector of downtown, it certainly is a powerful image. But its real beauty is the way in which the headquarters addresses public open space, and how that open space transfers the idea of pedestrian movement and sequential experience through very simple devices such as the pergola you see in the program, which brings me back full circle to what I said in the beginning, that the design of the public realm, however one evolves it as a system, must be the fundamental issue of urban design theory. Thank you very much.
If you have any question, I'm sure David will be glad to answer. Francis.
I think I'm not trying to evade the question, Francis, but it is an extremely difficult one to answer, because one of the things I noticed coming back to the United States, that I've been on brief visits in the interim period, but coming back here to live, was the way in which American cities have changed radically, dramatically and permanently from the cities as I understood them and viewed them, say, in the late 1950s. And what I mean by this is with growing mobility and growing affluence of American families, with not just one car per family, but a car for each member of the family, the cities spread laterally, and the reason they spread laterally was that it's a huge continent and land is relatively cheap, and you got the polycentric city establishing itself, which is one of the reasons why downtowns have declined in a terminal fashion. And I don't know, even if it's desirable, it should be altered, it can be altered. And that is why, to answer your question directly, I have great difficulty in making up my mind about developments like Seaside, or perhaps in the 1970s Reston, Newtown and Virginia, because to me they're essentially artificial. I think both in their own ways are extremely pretty developments, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sort of way, but they're in a sense something out of a dream world. They're not real. They're not what I understand to be mid-America, which is Main Street, and is really what Venturi was talking about in Learning from Las Vegas. So whether or not the development of entities like Seaside is appropriate, I can't make up my mind. I would say it is partially phony, because far from being a multicultured, multi-ethnic, multi-income society, it's anything but. It's very privileged, and if one looks at developments around the world created in similar privileged circumstances, I can think of Port Grimaud in the south of France by François Boéry, and that is very beautiful, but it's again something which is the stuff of which dreams are made. It's a very affluent, very beautiful, very well-maintained community. But if you think of that with poor families living there, if they could, one wonders how that sort of environment would succeed. And it goes back even further, say, to the beginning of the century in Wales, when Clough Williams-Ellis built Portmeirion, which was an architectural folly, which he said so himself. It was a self-indulgence of building what he thought was an Italianate village on the Welsh coast. Now I'm told that the designers, Duani and Plater Zybeck, are now designing a whole host of different communities. But at the Oxford conference we both attended last year, there was a presentation in one of the workshops of Seaside by a young planning professor from, I think she was from University of California, I'm not sure, but she was a sociologist, and she took a very jaundiced view about Seaside, and she took some of the most skillful photographs I've ever seen, because it showed it in what appeared to be the tail end of a hurricane, and when you saw it through her eyes and through these grisly photographs of glowering rain clouds and so on, you saw it in a totally different light of how it might be as an ordinary settlement, and it became much less convincing, I thought.
To take another end of that, you think of all this responsibility over nature city.
You guys asked two clever questions, because that's again something that is hard for me to answer. In fact, I was talking to somebody at a landscape architects meeting in Kansas City when I was talking about what I thought were edge cities, and he told me it was, well, I won't tell you the exact expression, but he told me it was a load of nonsense, that his interpretation of edge city was very different to mine. But in the conventional or the popular interpretation, the edge city really goes back to what I was saying to Francis about polycentric American cities. It's an inevitable and worrying condition of the city, because edge city exists, as I'm sure you know, along the I-71 corridor north of Cincinnati, beyond the I-275, going up to the Kings Island theme park, and in a sense it's worse than the original polycentric cities, because the polycentric cities, which were based around the shopping malls that grew up mostly in the 1960s and to some extent into the 70s, did focus upon communities in a loosely structured radial system. Edge cities are essentially linear in nature, and that has all sorts of very serious implications for metropolitan development, and it's very different to strip development, which Venturi was talking about, I think.
It seems to me that your lecture is very, very important in terms of the idea of docklands areas worldwide are having to be changed because you have no use for that kind of dock city or the things around shipping. So the problem goes to Woollen, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina, and Charleston, and Copenhagen. It's a worldwide problem. The revitalization of this land on the north of the city.
I agree with you absolutely, and interestingly enough, in my fights with the London Docklands Development Corporation officials, the Whitehall Mandarins, was the fact that I can't remember the exact year, but sometime early in the 1980s, I was asked for a British journal to review an American publication called Urban Waterfront Development, I think, and it was published by the Urban Land Institute in Washington. And it's a very fine book. I don't know whether you know it, but it's a very good source of reference. And the thing that opened my eyes about that was that American urban waterfront redevelopment and development and renewal has been done far more efficiently, far more sensitively than the attempts on a huge scale in London Docklands. And the thing that came out of that book, which I found also very interesting, was that the authors said that the way in which the most successful urban waterfront developments in the United States and Canada, whether they were seaside or riverside or even lakeside developments, took place, was that it was a very skillful combination or partnership of federal government, of local state or city government, and private investment. And the authors maintained, and I don't know whether this is correct or not, that in the most successful developments there was major public investment put into land reclamation, but more importantly to landscaping prior to development taking place, so that in a sense they were putting something on display to the private investors, unlike London Docklands, of not derelict, decaying industrial land, but land which had already been revitalized, which then became an attractive focus of private sector investment. I hope that's true, but the point I was trying to make to the Docklands Development Corporation, they couldn't expect the private sector in general until Olympia York came along to regard London Docklands as anything but an environmental disaster, and that is no way to sell development land, I think. I think worldwide, since I've been critical of some of my American brethren during the course of my lecture, I would like to say something which is wholeheartedly full of praise. I think the best pioneering developments of waterfront development are to be found here in North America, which are examples of really how to go about it in a positive and creative sort of way. I don't know whether you agree with that or not.
I just thank the Lord we don't have all those colors.
Right. Sure. Well, my description is visual anarchy, and that's a view I still hold. Well, thank you for being so patient. I'm sorry I ran over time.